Hello and welcome to the Centre for Policy Studies panel at the Spectator's Alternative Conference. On the topic is there a free market vision for levelling up, which I guess has two components. Is there a free market vision in the government for levelling up? And can there be a free market vision for levelling up? And indeed, what does levelling up mean? It's a phrase we often hear quite a lot about. Joining me to discuss this are two great experts on levelling upwards, downwards, and in all directions. Douglas Carswell is the former MP for Clapton and head of the Good Governance Project, as well as one of the pioneers of the Localism movement, which made the argument that Britain is a ghastly centralised country and would do a lot better if we levelled up and devolved power. And Sam Bowman is formerly of the Adam Smith Institute and is now Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics. We've only got half an hour, guys, so I guess if we just crack on with it. If you have any questions, please do just fire them away via the Spectator app or even the YouTube screen, and we'll do our best to tackle them. And I should say, I'm Robert Colville. I'm director of the CPS, founded by this lady here, who, among her many talents, was not a great fan of localism, really, and is. I mean, of the few charges that can be levelled against her with truth is that one of the reasons levelling up might be needed is because crushing the left meant taking power from local councils and centralising it. With that, let's begin. Sam, is there a free market vision for levelling up?
Yes, there is. And since I know we're pretty short on time, I'm going to focus on just one aspect of kind of levelling up that I think could make a huge difference, and I think is pretty clearly a free market policy. A lot of people think about levelling up as being about spending, but actually a lot of the things we need to do, as I think the kind of localism agenda might suggest, is remove biases that exist, either explicit biases or more often biases we're not really aware of that favour certain parts of the country, especially places like London, where I'm in right now, and disfavour other parts of the country. So I think the biggest bias that we could eliminate is the bias against investment in physical machinery in the tax code and physical buildings in the tax code. And this is really a quirk of the tax system to do with how we treat business investment versus other forms of business spending. So if you run a business, the spending you put into things like rent, things like wages, things like pens and paper, you can deduct from your tax bill today. It's a business expense. It's not counted for the purposes of taxation. But if you invest in something like physical machinery for a factory or in buildings for, let's say, again, a factory, you have to depreciate that investment over the notional lifespan of the investment. And that can take many, many years, even decades in some cases. And what that means is that, in fact, because of things like inflation and because of things like the time value of money, the things you could do with the money other than investing in those things, in fact, businesses that invest in things like physical machinery and buildings can only deduct part of the investment from their tax bill. In the case of machinery, it's about 76%, and in the case of buildings, it's about 28%, although that changes quite a lot for kind of slightly technical reasons that fluctuates quite wildly over time. The rest of that money, so about 25% in the case of machinery and about 75% in the case of buildings, is taxed as if you had drawn that investment as profit. Now, that's a huge disincentive to that kind of investment, and it's a huge bias in favor of business activity that's based on, let's say, high-skilled workers, that's based on valuable office space, it's based on the kinds of things that services and places like London do really well at, but places like Wrecker and Hull and other parts of the country don't do so well at. Now, to put this in international perspective, the UK is 35th out of 36 OECD countries at this tax cost recovery, it's called. The only country that's worse than the UK for this is Chile. Every other OECD country, including France, Germany, Italy, Canada, all of them are better than we are, and some of them are much, much better than we are. And it's actually gotten worse in some respects in the last 10 or 15 years. So under Osborne, we all know about the reductions in the headline rate of the capital of corporation tax. But to pay for some of those headline rate reductions, the Treasury made this kind of cost recovery less generous. So even though your headline tax bill was falling, the things that you could deduct from that tax bill, the things that would actually count as business investment, were becoming less generous. So some forms of business investment were becoming worsely treated and more harshly penalized by the tax system than they had been before. Now, evidence from the US that's been cited in a CPS paper, the Adam Smith Institute has talked about this, lots of think tanks are talking about this. Evidence from the US suggests that if you move to a system where you could deduct all business investment, the same way you can deduct pens and paper, rent, wages, if you could deduct investment in machinery, we could increase investment by 17.5%, we could increase wages by 2.5%. That's a good year of wage growth, just to put that in general terms, and that's several very, very, very good years of investment growth. And all we would need to do is make the system neutral. So this would be good, I think, for one reason, because I like a neutral tax code, but for a second reason, from a levelling up point of view, because it would end this bias that I've talked about that favours places like London and disfavours parts of the country where manufacturing is or could be a much, much bigger part of output and the economy. So it's not it could be quite expensive in the short term, but over about a 7-year period, it looks as if, and I think this is based on CPS calculations, it looks as if the system could become cost neutral or even cost positive over 7 years. Now, normally it might be difficult to get the Treasury to accept something like this, but these are not normal times, and everybody knows that we need to make big, bold moves to increase investment and to get the economy moving again once we've seen the back of this pandemic. And I think this should be the top of our agenda. It's great for levelling up, and I think it would make us all a lot richer.
So, Douglas, well, thank you very much for the shout-outs to the CPS there. Douglas, with one tax cut, we can be free, or is there more to levelling up than just this? I mean, I'm thinking, you represented one of the most deprived coastal communities in the country, which would something like this have?
Sam spoke very eloquently, and I've never heard anyone make that case quite so eloquently, as succinctly as Sam made, and I don't think any of us could disagree with what he said there. I think it's worth just taking a step back on this whole question of a free market vision for levelling up. Why are we asking this question? Boris won and created a very successful electoral coalition at the last election, and discovered, to the surprise of many in his own party, that it contained what you might call some non-traditional Tory voters and supporters. Voters in blue-collar voters in provincial England and Wales, not so much Scotland, but certainly provincial England and Wales. And naturally, the thought was, what can we do to deliver for people like this? What can we do to deliver not only in the so-called red wall seats of County Durham, but places like Clacton, which I used to represent, which certainly weren't traditional Tory territory. I think one of the things that we certainly should avoid doing is replacing years of what you might call Labour condescension towards those communities with a form of Tory condescension towards those communities. This idea that you have to do things for them by fiat. The question shouldn't be, how can we eliminate regional disparities? There was a time in this country when there were no regional disparities, and that was in the Middle Ages, when you had self-sufficient local communities and everyone was dirt poor. You need some form of regional disparities, and you shouldn't try to eliminate regional disparities, because that's the essence of a market system based on specialization and exchange. And you shouldn't try to direct growth. The question shouldn't be, how do we direct growth? I think if you did that, you would end up in very murky water very quickly. The question really should be, how can we ensure that there is opportunity as widespread as possible, and that the government doesn't do things which unnecessarily exacerbate inequalities? And I think there are some bad ideas we can avoid doing. I mean, the idea that somehow moving the House of Lords to York is going to affect this is a nonsense. I think too, we've got to be very skeptical about those who say, government should spend money on an R&D research facility, Silicon Valley on Tyne. I mean, I think those sorts of ideas are also, Matt Wrigley, whose book is on the shelf behind me, explains rather beautifully why innovation doesn't happen by top-down fiat. So I think there are half a dozen things the government should look to do, and they're all based on the free market. And the first is localism. All governments talk about passing power away from Whitehall outwards to the town hall, but they never actually pass control over the finances. So I think we need to turn VAT, which is a tax that we pay because we're in the EU. We should turn VAT, now that we've left the EU, into a local sales tax. And the Adam Smith Institute, which Sam worked for, wrote this a brilliant paper written by some obscure author a decade or so ago on paying for localism, which explained how one might do this. some people say, hang on, if you localize control over revenue, you would exacerbate regional differences. Actually, I disagree. COVID has shown quite how illiberal local councils can be, local authorities and regional governments can be. They're instinctively illiberal. Giving them control over tax raising powers, I think, would force them to offer enterprise lower tax and spend alternatives. It would force some of them to think differently. I'm a big fan of the idea of free ports, the Centre for Policy Studies. I think your author of a famous paper on free ports has gone on to become Chancellor of the Exchequer. Rishi Sunak's paper on free ports, I think, is an absolute blinder. And if the Chancellor is looking for a way to ensure there is more widespread economic growth, I think he could look at that paper he himself wrote and make it a reality. It's a wonderful paper full of ideas about how to stimulate growth, and I would encourage the government to take that up. And I think generally cutting corporation tax is a good thing. I sometimes struggle to find good things to say about the previous Chancellor George Osborne, but one thing he undoubtedly did do was extend the so-called enterprise investment scheme. And we need more of that. One of the reasons why London and the UK generally is this hotbed of startups is because rich people, instead of giving large sums of money to the Chancellor, can offset some of that by, in effect, investing in startups. And I think if we could see some sort of regional variant of the EIS scheme, that would be great. Infrastructure. I'm not an anarchist. I think government does need to do things, and I think it needs to invest in infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure, and do so in a more regionally, with a more regional horizon. Planning liberalisation. You know, we need to liberalise planning so that areas of the country that are underdeveloped, or areas of the country that frankly don't have a lot of retail or real estate investment, can liberalise planning to encourage that. It's not something that can be done centrally. We're talking about liberalising planning in Whitehall under this government, still with the same outlook of all previous governments, which is where can we put the houses? If we had true liberalisation, we wouldn't be trying to second guess where the development would go. Let the localities set their own planning policies, and I think we would see growth and innovation. We desperately need that. There are other things we could do, but I think that's a start. Localized finance, free ports, cutting corporation tax, allowing investors to invest in startups, and then liberalising all those absurd restrictive rules on planning. And if the government wants to put on a hard hat and spend money, do it. You know, infrastructure is so often related to transport. So often when we talk about transport, we talk about London-based transport ideas and priorities and schemes. I think we need to think about transport infrastructure investments that help cities in the provinces, not just London. I think if we did that, we could make a huge difference to towns and cities out there across the country.
Yes. So we've had quite enough mutual admiration already, but I should mention another CPS report called A Rising Tide by our head of business, Nick King, which points out that that shifting infrastructure to outside of London is not a case of sort of government trying to tilt the balance. It's a case of untilting a balance which has already been tilted. If you look at how much has already been given to London and the southeast, it's not been a fair fight on that. But I want to come back to the question about so you guys have produced those are I would sign up to pretty much all of those ideas. I think there is definitely a free market version of levelling up. The question is, how much do you feel? And Rishi Sunak wrote the book, literally wrote the book on this, or the think tank report. The question is, how much does government get it? Because what happened after the election is kind of what always happens when a party wins an election, that the civil service looked at the manifesto and saw it had this word levelling up in it, and then it. And every department decided to try and work out what levelling up meant. And every department pretty much concluded that levelling up meant what it was already doing. So the education department suddenly decided that levelling up meant improving education in various different parts of the country. The transport department decided levelling up meant building new railways in different parts of the country. The in different parts of the country was all the same, but there wasn't a kind of consensus about what this meant. I mean, do you think there is a coherent vision within government for what levelling up means beyond just infrastructure spending? And do you think it is a free market vision?
Not yet, I would say. I mean, I think the fundamental problem that's bedeviled governments over the past 30 years is a lack of strategic coherence. So that, when you get a buzzword like levelling up, or before that, I think it was sustainability, these cliches become cliches to mask the existing priorities of the government bureaucracy, and nothing ever really changes. You need, if you're going to have levelling up, you need strategic coherence at the centre, and that fundamentally means rewiring the relationship between Downing Street, the Cabinet Office, and the Treasury. The Treasury, I think, has been the great force of malevolence in a lot of reform attempts. It's this great sort of blob with delusions of grandeur as to the extent to which you can engineer social and economic outcomes. I think you need to fundamentally recalibrate the architecture of government involving those three institutions. I noticed that countries like Ireland, which has a dedicated department that oversees public expenditure, they not only tend to get better value for money, but I think it means that a government there can actually achieve its strategic objectives more effectively. So I think if we're going to achieve any of this, we need strategic coherence at the centre, and that means getting the architecture of Whitehall fundamentally changed, and doing so pretty quickly, because the clock is ticking. If we try to use the dysfunctional architecture of government to achieve any of this, it's just going to be, it's just going to be lip service to localism and lip service to levelling up.
Sam, would you agree?
I agree with a lot of what Douglas has said. On your question, I think one of the problems is that levelling up is a slightly empty phrase. I don't think you can really accuse previous kind of governments of not caring about other parts of the country than London. And maybe the things they did in practice benefited London.
But we have a great case study of this. The Blair government spent untold billions on regional funds, and proved definitively that they top-down spending-driven version of infrastructure.
Right, and we can't get away from the fact that London is an incredibly productive place, and the areas around London in the southeast are incredibly productive, and it's really, really difficult to make other places, to take Wales, which is 85% of the national average in terms of productivity, is really difficult to bring it up to where London is, which is 133% of average national productivity. There's kind of magic in cities, and there's magic in agglomeration effects. The economic benefits we get when people are close together. And part of the challenge is, number one, it's really unpopular when you point out that, in practice, that we care about people, not places. We should, if somebody in an underprivileged town around the country would be better off and would like to move to somewhere like London, then often the best thing for them is to make it easier for them to move to London. And there's no getting away from that. And if they don't want to move to London, if they can't move to London, there's a ceiling on how much more productive they can become, no matter what we do, no matter, even if we lived in a kind of free market utopia. And the second problem is that overall growth matters a great deal, and overall prosperity often does there kind of actually is a trickle down effect whereby the rest of the country does really well because in relative terms, because London and the southeast is really, really productive and rich, not just through tax receipts, but through investment and through kind of skills and kind of knowledge diffusion and things like that. So while the kind of levelling up agenda is obviously good because it's good to make any poor place or relatively poor place richer, if it comes at the expense of making a place like London kind of less productive or less valuable or grow less, then that could be a bad thing overall. So it's kind of why I at least, and I think Douglas did as well, emphasize sort of no regrets policies. Policies that help us lift up or help us kind of eliminate biases that are holding down places, I think are really, really good. But policies that try to move investment from one part of the country to another, I think could be really dangerous and really destructive.
Yes, the reason it's called levelling up is presumably because they used to call it rebalancing, but then that suggested that London would have, like, the seesaw would go and that London would come down. So, levelling up sounds like everyone's a winner. But I'd summarise the first half of your remarks as get on your bike, but only if you want to.
Well, sure, yeah. There are inescapable economic facts. Cities are very, very likely to be more productive than towns, which are very, very likely to be more productive than villages. We might wish that wasn't the case, but it is the case. from a policy point of view, there are things that we can do to harness cities. We can make it, focusing on infrastructure that allows people to commute more easily and more quickly. That's a really great way of increasing the kind of potential job market for each person. Given, let's assume that people don't really want to move because they have attachments or they have kids in schools and things like that. So there are things like that we can do. But it's pretty unpopular to say that. The Theresa May government, in its sort of dying days, one of its big attempts at getting good headlines was the fund for towns, and there was this big fad for towns in around kind of 2018, 2019. It never really went anywhere, and there wasn't actually very much money there, but there was a clear attempt to kind of win towns over. And I don't know how popular it would be to say to towns, look, economically, there's just no way we can make you as rich as Manchester or Leeds. We could possibly plug you into Manchester and Leeds better. We could make it easier for people who live in these places to commute to Manchester and Leeds to get, depending on where they are, to get better jobs, and that might make you better off. But there's basically no going back to an economy that might have existed 100 years ago. And often the best thing we can do is facilitate change rather than trying to stop it.
Which leads us very nicely onto a question from Douglas, who I assume is a different Douglas who is watching this out there, rather than Douglas Carswell tapping away at the screen, which is, what effect does COVID have on this? If remote working is causing, if we're leading to a remote working world, if the cities are emptying, how do we use those choices to inform state action? Douglas C, do you want to?
I think one of the things that COVID definitely tells us is that we shouldn't take the prosperity that we have in our capital city, London, for granted. A year ago, if we'd been having this conversation, I think we would have tilted far more towards the idea of directing growth away from London, that somehow, London needed to have less growth so others could have more. I hope that one of the things that COVID has shown is that actually growth is a very, very precious and fragile thing, and it can easily be destroyed rather than diverted. And rather than doing things to divert it, you can inadvertently just destroy it altogether. Look, the prosperity of a community is contingent upon the intensity of specialization and exchange within that community. And big cities are always going to be home to more specialization and exchange. What we need to do is to facilitate more specialization and exchange in cities and remove barriers to specialization and exchange outside big cities like London too. I hope that COVID shows that actually there are a whole bunch of rules and regulations, whether it's to do with clinical trials or whether you can sell pizza on a street corner. There are a whole bunch of rules and regulations that frankly we could get rid of and be better off for it. But I hope that one of the consequences of, London at the moment is going through a really tough time. And there's even talk of London becoming a sort of economic donut with the centre dying. I think that may be a little bit overdone, but I don't think we should take prosperity in London at all for granted. There are plenty of cities around the world that once thought that they were financial centres by birthright. Venice and Amsterdam and a whole bunch of others. If we're not careful, London could become another has-been. So I hope COVID shows that we shouldn't take anything for granted. Teleworking and changes in work patterns, do you know what? I don't really buy that. I think people are making the best of a bad job, but fundamentally, for people to be productive over the long term, they need to meet. They need that serendipitous intervention. There's a reason why Google has built its big new European headquarters in London. You need people to come together and to meet, and you need that spontaneity. And yes, we can do all sorts of clever things on Zoom, and we can talk like we're talking now, but nothing in terms of innovation and productivity beats that face-to-face interaction.
Sam, any thoughts on that? I mean, I suppose one thing I'd say, Douglas, I mean, you're probably right from an economic point of view, but if I'm a political strategist sitting there thinking how I win the Tories the next election and looking at London as a city that doesn't vote Tory, suggesting that we should channel, we should try and support the people in the non-cities who do vote Tory, that would be a fairly logical course of action. Just if you're being doing that kind of cynical, whatever cash is around, let's give it to our people kind of thinking.
Well, think of London like a cash cow in that case. Even if the people there don't vote Tory, and I think one of the reasons for that is that it's really difficult for them to form families because housing is so expensive. But even if the people there aren't voting Tory, they're paying for people who do vote Tory to have better lives and go have better schools and better infrastructure. So they're valuable for that reason. I totally agree with Douglas, pretty much every word for word. I'm sorry to say, I wish we could disagree and it would be more entertaining. I mean, COVID will be over at some point. There are more than 200 vaccine candidates. There are 11 in phase 3 trials. At some point, sooner or later, and I think probably sooner rather than later, COVID will be over. And a lot of what we've learned will be that, okay, teleworking is kind of remote working is possibly more viable than we thought at the margin. But for most people, cities aren't just about working. Cities are pleasant because they have lots of culture and restaurants and bars and people, and there will never be a replacement for the social pool of people when you're young, especially, and trying to make friends and trying to meet people. Really, cities are irreplaceable in that respect. But the solution, I think, and it goes back to the point I made earlier, is make it easier for people to move in and out of cities when they want to, not when economics requires them to. And if you do that, then I think you possibly will have far fewer kind of conservative voting families leaving London, and you'll have less of this kind of red city effect. And again, that's good for people in the kind of places that need to be leveled up, because often those people would like to move to cities, and not just London, Leeds, Manchester, Edinburgh. There are cities all over the country that are really prosperous and really great to live in, that it's really difficult to get to because the rents are so high. And making it easier to for people to move to those places and stay there if they want to, I think would be a huge benefit in terms of leveling up, as long as we think about people rather than just places.
Yeah, so it's interesting that both of you seem to be saying that that leveling up shouldn't be about taking Dorsetshire and trying to increase its slice of the government pie by X%. It should be about a sort of economic vision of the country that thinks about individual opportunity more, that thinks about connectivity, that thinks about, as you said, Douglas, local control of where you're.
Yeah,
it can.
Go ahead,
Douglas.
After you.
Okay. The reason is that it can't be anything else. The modern economies are built on knowledge and skills and ideas. They're sometimes, and to go back to my earlier remarks, we can hold back the application of those ideas, and we can hold back innovative new manufacturing techniques and things like that. But ultimately, the way we get richer is by coming up with better ideas. And the way we come up with better ideas is by sitting around with other people and talking with them and arguing with them, not just in the office, but at the pub and things like that as well. That's really where that's why growth happens. And the idea that we can reverse that, or the idea that kind of growth doesn't have to happen in kind of big pools of people where people are around each other all the time and talking with each other all the time, I think is just a fantasy. So even though it might be nice, I love cities, but a lot of people don't, and I know that many people would rather live in a small town. They'd rather be able to walk to kind of green fields and things like that very easily. But that comes at a kind of fundamental economic cost, and there's pretty much nothing we can do about that.
I know that there'll be Conservative MPs over the next few years who panic to think that, hang on, if we just leave this to the free market, we need to be seen to be doing something. Every one of the 5 elections I stood for Parliament as a candidate in, every time I stood and I saw off my opponents, they always, I think, tended to condescend towards voters by saying, if you vote for me, I will divert government resources. I will make sure the government spends more pork barrel politics in our community. I don't think it's credible, and I don't think the voters will buy it. I think actually if politicians talk the language of giving people the opportunity to do things for themselves as communities, it is popular. The old idea from the 60s and the 70s that you vote for people to divert resources to enrich your community, I don't think that's plausible. I think free market ideas can be popular, they can be populist, and they can win against those promoting more patrician, patronizing, condescending alternatives.
So you've accidentally answered the next question I was going to ask on behalf of one of our viewers, which is how politically viable are the things, are the bits of this agenda which are not about just building new bypasses?
If you've been looking at British politics over the past 4 or 5 years, the one thing you will, I hope, learn is that condescension and patronizing politics where people are going to do things, politicians are going to do things for other people. They're just not plausible anymore. There's a huge opportunity here, I think, to make free market ideas correctly packaged and pitched as very appealing to a restless electorate who just simply doesn't believe in the old style top-down command and control system anymore.
But I suppose part of the problem is that free market is associated with the idea of winners and losers, and people are in uncertain times. People are looking for protection as much as they are looking for opportunity. I mean, how do you?
Don't associate it with winners and losers. Put it, for example, if you want to level up education, give every mum and dad in the country, give every mum and dad in the poorest neighbourhoods of Clacton or County Durham the same choices over where their child goes to school that rich people in London have. School choice, a great levelling up idea that can be packaged as about allowing people to improve the outcomes and the opportunities for their children. Now, if you pitch these things the right way, you can do incredibly well. No disrespect to think tanks. I've written for some think tanks, but you've got to take free market ideas and retail them in a way that is appealing. And I think you can really do that in a way that is incredibly appealing. I don't think you should, free marketers shouldn't be afraid of our own shadows.
Sam, we're almost out of time. Anything to add to that, apart from heartfelt agreement?
A final policy that I really think road pricing, we often think of road pricing as a thing that is relevant to London, but actually the thing that road pricing is most good for is commuters who spend hours in traffic trying to get to and from work. And road pricing that would make roads flow freely between towns and cities would be probably the best possible thing we could do for people who are not plugged into the engines of growth, the cities that are near them, because it's just too inconvenient and too slow to get to them. So really road pricing is one of the counterintuitively best policies that we haven't talked about for levelling up. And I think as fuel revenues go down, as we all move to electric cars, we're going to have to come up with some other way of raising revenues. Road pricing is a kind of win-win in that respect.
Well, thank you both very, very much. I think the knowledge and ideas that have poured forth from you both have shown that there definitely is a free market vision for levelling up, and let's hope the government accepts it. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Robert Colville. Please follow @CPS Think Tank on Twitter and sign up to our newsletter and do all of the lovely things that will enable you to get even more of our brilliant reports. And please enjoy the rest of the Spectator's wonderful alternative conference over the next few days. Thank you very much.